Hello, everyone. Following my series on Uttarakhand history, where we learned about the Gorkha Wars with the Kumaon and Garhwal kingdoms in the late 1700s to early 1800s, I've also recently learned about the Sikkimese involvement in the Sino Nepalese War. So, the Kingdom of Nepal not only engaged in war with China/Tibet in the late 1700s, but it also tried to expand westward into what is now known as Uttarakhand in India. And during this process, the kingdom of Sikkim was also involved between the two great powers, the British Empire and the Chinese Qing dynasty, or the Manchu Qing dynasty, depending on your perspective of the events. And one historian, Dr. Saul has written about how many specialists are unaware of the extent of Sikkimese involvement in the Sino Nepalese War in 1788 to 1792. And so we'll just talk a little bit about his findings. And what inspired me was His Holiness's recent teaching in Gangtok, Sikkim, which I watched with great enthusiasm, as well as some recent protests in Darjeeling, Sikkim, regarding a pregnant woman who unfortunately died due to negligence in a hospital in Darjeeling. For the purpose of this short presentation, I will use this map of modern China, and I have marked Sikkim with this orange pencil. So there has been an eastward expansion of Nepal, which caused significant pressure to the Kingdom of Sikkim in the 1780s and 1790s. And the author of this book asserts that the actual invasion of the boundaries of modern Sikkim coincided with the Sino Nepalese War. So the Gurkhas were invading this area. It was caused by a number of factors, including high tariffs on the trans-Himalayan trade through Nepal, the devaluation of the Tibetan currency, and the opening of the Chumbi Valley trade route between Tibet and Sikkim as a means of avoiding Nepalese trade tariffs. Most studies of this war have been written from the Chinese, Tibetan, or Nepali perspective, both of which fail to take into consideration the role of the Sikkimese in this war. So if you search Wikipedia, this is true, by the way. There is a degree of confusion as to what actually happened in Sikkim during this war, though for the most part it seems almost certain that the Gurkhas did invade Sikkim and captured most of the Sikkimese territory up to the Tista River, including all of the modern districts of South and West Sikkim, as well as Darjeeling, which gave Nepal and Bhutan a common border. Ultimately, the Sikkimese rallied under Rinzing, who was subsequently killed, and Yukphyo, who succeeded in pushing the Gurkhas back across the border. The Sikkimese palace archives contain a number of documents from this period regarding Sikkimese involvement in the war, including a couple of military dispatches between the commander of Chinese forces and Yukphyo, son of Garbang and Sikkimese military general. In one such document, the Chinese authorities request Yukphyo to maintain a military presence on the Nepal-Sikkim border, with additional requests that Yukphyo lead the Sikkimese army into Nepal in the event of Nepal invading Tibet. The letter implies that if the Nepalese invade Tibet, they would leave their right flank exposed, allowing the Sikkimese to penetrate deep into Nepal to open an eastern front, divert Gorkha troops toward the east, and thus allow the Chinese forces to regroup and launch a counterattack into Nepal. In another dispatch, Yukphyo and other Sikkimese generals are asked to rendezvous with the Chinese general to coordinate the invasion of Nepal. The important role Yukphyo played during this war has yet to be recognized in studies of this period, and the palace documents seem to suggest that his role was not merely a regional one, but was actually part of the Chinese military strategy. His role was subsequently rewarded by the governments of Tibet, who granted him Rinag, an estate on the Chumbi-Sikkim-Bhutan border. Bhutan, who granted him an estate in Rishi and Damzang near Kalimpong, and Sikkim, who promoted him to the position of chancellor. Whilst the role of Sikkimese generals in the Sino-Nepalese War seems to have been important, the outcome Sikkim failed to receive the rewards it had hoped for, and in fact made considerable losses as a result of the final peace treaty between China and Nepal. In the peace treaty, Nepal retained possession of all Sikkimese territory, despite the fact that Sikkim had already recaptured these lands. The Chinese attempted to placate the Sikkimese, who were obviously outraged by the treaty, in a number of correspondences, which state that the Sikkim-Nepal border have been delimited, but if Sikkim and Nepal dispute the border established during the time of the sixth Dalai Lama would be reinstated. This would have benefited the Sikkimese. For those of you who don't know, the sixth Dalai Lama is considered by Chinese history to be a puppet of the Mongols slash multi-fronted intrigues. For the purpose of today's program, I also want to highlight that he is from the Mon tribe, and the ethnic group of Lepchas in Sikkim is also known by the name of Mon. And from the Chinese Amban to the Sikkimese government, which attempted to buy off the Sikkimese with expensive gifts. The Sikkimese were probably quite unhappy about the situation, as the Chinese had no intention of reopening treaty negotiations, which may have had the result of increasing conflict between Nepal and China/Tibet. However, the unintended result of this was the growing resentment Sikkim felt towards China-Tibet and Nepal, and the desire of Sikkim to reclaim its possessions no matter what. The opportunity to exact revenge on Nepal and cause China concern came with the Anglo-Gurkha War, where Sikkim could reclaim its possessions west of the Tista and ignore Chinese requests to avoid contact with the British. And so one can read in terms of the historical continuities of Sikkim and a broader Tibetan culture. However, there was a breakdown in Anglo-Sikkimese relation when the British response to the Kotapa rebellion from 1826 onwards angered the Sikkimese because they felt the British were not upholding their side of the Treaty of Segoli, which specifically protected Sikkim from Nepali aggression. The Kotapa rebellion was a classic Sikkimese internal political dispute born out of the growing domination of Sikkimese politics by the Barphung clan. In short, the sons of Kotakunga, the brother of Bolod, objected to the assassination of somebody and led a rebellion against Sukfut Nambikyal. The Kota brothers fled to Ilam, their patrimonial estate, and made contact with the Gorkhas, who supported their insurrection by upholding Sikkimese prisoners in Nepal. In response to Gorkha involvement, the Sikkimese government wrote to the British, specifically Lloyd, in 1822, asking the British to rectify this issue with particular reference to the loss of revenue and taxation from the Gorkha/Kotapa held lands of Morang. The British responded by supplying the Sikkimese with arms and money in 1831, but this was a case of a little too late. Meanwhile, in 1832, the Chinese and Tibetan authorities had been asked to intervene, and a representative was sent from Phagri to negotiate with the Kotapa and Gorkhas in 1832, but were prevented from entering Sikkim by supporters of the Kotapa, who set up a blockade of the main pass, and the Gorkha government apparently refused entry to Chinese or Tibetan officials to the Nepal border region. In the end, the Tibetan and Chinese opted to send an order demanding that the Kotapa and their supporters cease their activities and rejoin the Sikkimese fold, an order which was ignored by the Kotapa. The British only got involved during the negotiations to settle the dispute, which was considered pro-Sikkimese by the Gorkha officials, but in actuality benefited the Gorkhas by designating the Sikkim-Nepal boundary at the Mechi River, ceding Morang and Ilam to Nepal, but returning Darjeeling to Sikkim. The Sikkimese were not totally convinced that the British were acting impartially, as were the Tibetans, who wrote in a letter to the Sikkimese that the British were actually supporters of the Kotapa. This general mistrust felt by the Sikkimese towards the British was exacerbated when in the early 1830s the British began requesting a portion of the Darjeeling Hills for a sanatorium, and thus we have the great Wes Anderson film, The Darjeeling Limited. Back to history. In this request, the British were being duplicitous, as the British had already secured a land grant from the Kotapa, which undoubtedly
put pressure on the Sikkimese to provide a land grant to the British, which they duly did in 1835. The ceding of Darjeeling to the British had a lasting impact on not only Anglo-Sikkimese relations, which fell into a steep decline after 1835, but also on Sikkim's relations with Tibet, China, and Bhutan. The key factor in the decline of Anglo-Sikkimese relations was the total misunderstanding of what the Darjeeling land grant meant to both the British and the Sikkimese. The British assumed that the land grant meant that Darjeeling had become sovereign British territory, whereas the Sikkimese understood this land grant according to Sikkimese land law. Land grants were issued to leading families in exchange for annual rents, loyalty to the Sikkimese throne, including the recognition of the supremacy of the Chogyal rights over the land, and adherence to Sikkimese law. A failure to uphold any of these conditions could result in the forfeiture of the land. The British failed to understand this and so believed Darjeeling was sovereign British territory, in which British law would prevail and not the rule of the Chogyals of Sikkim. Another key point of contention was the rapid development and expansion of Darjeeling, coupled with the encroachment of the British into Sikkimese territory. According to Sikkimese law, if land that was previously unused was cleared and developed, taxes still applied. However, the Sikkimese were given the impression by the British authorities that Darjeeling would only be used as a sanatorium for British officials to escape the heat and diseases of the Indian plains, and not as a forward platform for the expansion of British influence in Tibet and the Himalaya. The rapid economic development of Darjeeling as British territory surrounded by Sikkimese land on all sides caused the flight of numerous Sikkimese Misr who fled harsh conditions in Sikkim to join the expanding labor market and cash economy present in Darjeeling. Similarly, criminals from British territory often sought refuge in Sikkim. These and other conflicts between Darjeeling and Sikkim, which were largely based on cultural misunderstandings, caused a cooling in Anglo-Sikkimese relations. The capture and imprisonment of Campbell and Hooker in 1849, and the seizure of all Sikkimese territory south of the Rangit in 1850 by the British in revenge, which, according to the Gampa Treaty, amounted to a loss of Sikkimese revenue to the amount of rupees 46,000. This was followed by the occupation of Sikkim in 1860 to 1861 and the signing of the Tumlong Treaty of 1861. This treaty guaranteed British supremacy in Sikkim. The provisions of the treaty gave the British the right to construct a road into Sikkim, which the Sikkimese were required to maintain, and to construct rest houses along the route. The Bagla Diwan was banished from Sikkim. Footnote. The Bagla Diwan was a bastion of Tibetan interests and largely blamed for the imprisonment of Campbell and Hooker and for Sikkimese hostility to the British. The Bagla Diwan, who was given the name meaning crazy prime minister by the British, was considered a relative of the Chogyal on account of his wife bearing the Chogyal an illegitimate child, and held considerable political leverage over the government from 1840 to 1861. Trade monopolies and tariffs on British goods were abolished, and the right of movement for Sikkimese Misr and British officials was established. British suzerainty over Sikkimese foreign affairs was in effect guaranteed by Clause 17, which gave the British the right to arbitrate disputes with Sikkim's neighbors, and Sikkim could not sell or lease land without British approval. In addition, the Chogyal was required to reside in Sikkim for at least 9 months a year and found a permanent capital in Sikkim. This was because of the Chogyal of Sikkim had a summer residency in Chumbi Valley, which lay outside of Sikkim's border according to the British. The final domination of Sikkim by the British occurred in 1888 after British troops expelled the Tibetan army from Longtu, established the office of the Sikkimese political officer, the first being J.C. White, who took control of the Sikkimese government. British ascendancy in Sikkim was finally recognized by the Britain-China Convention on the 17th of March 1890 and by the Sikkim-Tibet Convention of the 5th of December 1893, in which only Chinese and British officials participated to the exclusion of Sikkimese or Tibetans. Thanks so much for watching today's video on Sikkimese history.